Grief and joy are not opposites in my experience. In every process of grief and loss, I have had moments of joy and laughter and connection, and that feels more representative of the human experience.
Hi, welcome to the Global Joy Summit. I'm Shankari Goldstein from Mind and Life Institute and the Inspiring Minds host, and I'm delighted to be your host for this session today. I'm really excited to be speaking with Michelle Cassandra Johnson to explore the connection between joy and grief. Michelle is an author, a yoga teacher, social justice activist, an intuitive healer, and dismantling racism trainer. She approaches her life and work from a place of empowerment, embodiment, and integration. Michelle's newest book, Finding Refuge, Heartwork for Healing Collective Grief, and the second edition of Skill in Action were both published in 2021. So thank you so much for joining us, Michelle, today.
Thank you for inviting me to be here.
So Michelle, you have asked what it could look like to allow folks to make space for their grief and lean into one's personal responsibility to create conditions for liberation. This event is based around the work of two men who have been traumatized, suffered oppression, and faced exile. And in the midst of that grief, they continue to advocate for the liberation of all people. And of course, I'm speaking about His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And I think it's fair to say that in a global summit about joy, it would be really careless of us to not also speak about the suffering and collective grief that our planet has been facing over many decades, and most recently in the last 2 years with the global pandemic, racial reckoning, planetary climate crisis, and everyday challenges that everyday people face. And this is why we felt it was so necessary to invite you to join us to be in this summit, Michelle, because in your most recent publication, Finding Refuge, you take us through this journey that first begins with understanding the root of heartache. And sometimes people can think that joy is the opposite of sorrow and grief. So to begin, how are grief and joy related to you? Like, how do you see them show up in your practice?
Yeah, I love this question and exploration. I feel like grief and joy can exist alongside one another and are in deep relationship with one another. And Finding Refuge and an exploration of grief really came out of an awareness that in my experience, many spaces, institutions, organizations, relationships did not make space for me to center my grief, or for us, and I mean the collective, to center cultural trauma and our collective experience of grief. And I also feel like it's important to acknowledge that often as humans in these bodies, we're experiencing more than one thing at a time. And so while I have moved through various experiences of loss and made space to grieve individually and then in community with others, I also feel like it's essential to make space for joy, particularly in a culture, and I'm thinking about, when I say culture, dominance and superiority and sort of toxic cultural norms in a culture that really works through capitalism and other systems of supremacy and dominance to take joy away from us. And if we're less proximal to power, that's even more so, right? The ways in which joy or access to joy or access to conditions that will allow us to thrive, or the ability to determine what we need to thrive, these things are taken away. So I think they're not, grief and joy are not opposites in my experience. In every process of grief and loss, I have had moments of joy and laughter and connection, and that feels more representative of the human experience.
Yeah, and in the book, in the Book of Joy that Archbishop Desmond Tutu and His Holiness the Dalai Lama wrote with Doug Abrams, who's a part of this summit as well, they talk about the inseparability of joy and grief. And that's what I found that so fascinating, like that deep connection of your work and their work through the book, Finding Refuge. And in the book, Archbishop Desmond Tutu says, and I love this quote, "Discovering more joy does not save us from the inevitability of hardship and heartbreak. In fact, we may cry more easily, but we will laugh more easily too. Perhaps we are just more alive. Yet as we discover more joy, we can face suffering in a way that ennobles or elevates rather than embitters us. We have hardship without being hard. We have heartbreak without being broken. And I think this is such an important theme in your work as well, this calling to be present with your heart. And a part of this grief journey that you share is listening to our heart's intuition and understanding the alignment when the mind or the intellect comes into connection with the heart or the emotions. So in this polarizing and painful cycle of life, when it happens, how do we ask people to tap into their inner heart's wisdom and develop a partnership with their heart? Like, how do we begin to lean into those tender parts of brokenheartedness?
Yeah, I think this is, it's such an essential question, and it's an essential practice to tap into the heart. And it isn't always easy. And yet I feel like if we're awake to some of what is going on, the suffering that is all around and inside us, that calls us into the heart in a way, and it calls us to work with our hearts so that we can continue to survive and thrive and be in connection and community, in the face of so much suffering, some of which we may be perpetuating, the suffering that we're implicated in based on our different identities and our proximity to power. And I feel like there are so many distractions, right? Like capitalism doesn't want me to ask how my heart's doing. White supremacy doesn't want me to ask other Black, Indigenous, and people of color how their hearts are and how they're feeling. I have identities that are in closer proximity to power, which have taught me to do heartless things or to believe that I'm separate from other beings and the planet. And so I think that the heart work I'm talking about is not a bypass. It's not I have a good heart. Like I do, but that's not what it's about. It's about the deep work that you just mentioned and the ways in which we need to tend to the heart, because I believe we'll continue to create more heartbreak and suffering if we don't turn toward our hearts. And I also feel like the heart is such a pathway towards compassion and the process of remembering, right, how we are in connection with everyone and everything. So it's heart work to respond to heartbreak, and it's heart work to figure out how we're going to move forward together, if we are going to move forward together.
Yeah, you mentioned capitalism and this need for, like, society is kind of keeping us like away from connecting to our deeper, more heartfelt selves. I'm not saying that right, but just connecting more deeper to our heart. And I think this really like takes us into the next part of the journey of your book, which is wholeness. And you share this story in the book so beautifully of like being guided and seeing heron birds as you travel across the country. And in some ways you were being healed by the medicine energy of this bird as you face this personal journey of many lost ones that you were kind of turning and recognizing for the first time, or maybe not for the first time, but you were just you were being open to seeing and recognizing this healing energy. And there's so many parts about your book that I felt deeply connected to, but it led me to think of this story of my own in which I lost both my grandmothers within a few months of each other. And their deaths were like this final catalyst to just drop everything and embark on what I can now recognize and know as a spiritual journey across the globe. And every time I felt this wave of grief and tears and sickness or pain come over me, a butterfly would appear. And this butterfly would like lead me into temples of Lord Shiva in India, particularly. And I would inevitably cry and I would mourn the loss of not just my grandmothers, but I started to recognize I was mourning the loss of the life I once knew. And I was in like that pupa, that inner transition stage of the metamorphosis of this butterfly, because I knew I needed to not just shift understand my grief. I knew I needed to shift my life from that extreme pace of capitalism and dominant culture when I came back to the States. And no one was going to understand, or it felt like no one was understanding my grief except for these butterflies and Lord Shiva or these heron birds. Like nobody was understanding it. And when I returned to my normal, right, it wasn't normal at all. And my community like felt that. And sometimes we're like shying away from my personal transformation. And you talk about this extensively in the book about how we're all so vastly interconnected, right? Like my grief and pain is everyone's grief and pain. My healing is our healing. And I think this is like such an important thing to discuss. It's a real issue right now as people have become more aware of systems of injustice, institutionalized norms. You just said it, like being awakened to them is adding another layer to folks' heartache and collective grief. They don't want to participate in the system anymore. They don't want to participate in this fast-paced culture, but they're being swallowed up by it every single day, right? So like, how do we prioritize wholeness, and why is it important to pause and notice and recognize this collective grief experience that we're in?
Yeah, your question is making me think. I talked with my mom yesterday, which of course my mom is chapter 1, the root in the book. Clara is her name. And she lives in a retirement community, and she will be 80 next year. And so she lives with a bunch of elders in a retirement community. And she said something on the phone about, now my mom has a chronic illness and her body aches most of the time. But what she said yesterday was, my body aches in a different way. And she said, I was talking to some other people who live here and they're saying the same thing. And I think it's the world. That's what she said to me. And I was like, I think it's the world too, Mom. Like you're in all the ways you just named, Shankari, like, you know, she's feeling these systems of oppression. She's been aware of them. They've deeply impacted her based on her different identities for the whole of her life, and really worked to fragment her. And yet there is something she's noticing that's different about the impact of one thing after another, and then awakening to all that is going on in the suffering and the sorrow, and wondering when it will lessen or what we will do about it, right? Because there's urgency. So your question really made me think about how we're feeling this, how I'm wearing the suffering on my skin, quite literally, how it's something I can't escape from. And the story of wholeness and finding refuge came from loss of my father, my grandmother, living in a new place, going through a divorce. Like so many things were changing for me. And I was in a big period of transformation and transition. And then eventually, like I moved across the country, then I moved back across the country. I was working in an organization that I feel like in so many ways, the mission of the space was to respond to the ways in which, in particular, white supremacy fragments us, with an awareness that all systems of dominance and superiority are interconnected. But this organization focused on racial justice and racial equity. And I was in the middle of this transformation and deep grief and loss. And we were facilitating and inviting organizations to engage in culture shift work, right? To get with their hearts, to figure out new ways of being, to disrupt and dismantle toxic patterns within their organizations and beyond. And yet the container of that space, the organization, couldn't really hold my grief. And so there was a way I had to compartmentalize the fact that I was going through so much loss and in a new place, and I had to show up to work. And there was this way that, I mean, I've thought about wholeness for a long time as a human and as a therapist for a long time, working with people who truly believe they're broken, which is not what I believe about people and about humanity. So it wasn't a new thought to think about wholeness, but I was in this place of not being allowed to be my full whole self, especially if I was going to show up with a suitcase of grief. Given that I had so many unexpected losses when I moved across the country. And it made me think about how we as a space, and this, you know, it wasn't the first time I've experienced this in movement spaces or organizing spaces where we're like fighting to dismantle systems that are causing harm, but we're replicating those same systems by not actually allowing each other to show up as our full selves, by not centering ritual, by not centering practice, by not remembering we're connected to the earth because of the urgency of the problems and the suffering we're responding to. So it wasn't that dynamic wasn't new, but it was the experience of being in, I think, responding to the amount of grief I was responding to, and being in a space that was supposed to like invite people into humanity and wholeness, and not being allowed to do that made it feel like a different experience. And it sort of amplified all the ways in which dominant culture will work to fragment us. from ourselves, from each other, from the planet, and how that is just so damaging, I feel like, and toxic. So I feel like, this heart work is about wholeness, and how do we create conditions for people to be whole, not based on my definition of wholeness, but based on what wholeness means to them and to us collectively.
Yeah, and you spoke about that sense of urgency. I mean, there is so much happening in the planet, and so we feel like this rushed energy to fix it, and we hear this a lot. Like you and I, we work with organizations, and there's this like the first question is always like, how do we fix it? How do we just make the problem go away or make it better? And like you talk about it a lot. It's messy. There's not one size fits all, right? Like it's turning and kind of reimagining a new way of doing things. And part of addressing this change is valuing rest and breaks. And I just want to know, like, can resilience be seen as problematic, this sense of urgency, this need to fix everything, and be resilient? Can it be seen as problematic in regards to managing the day-to-day obstacles or even the bigger obstacles that the planet is facing? And why are boundaries like an important layer to your practice to avoid burnout in this fast-paced, urgent space?
Yeah, I think it depends on how we define resilience. Like, is rest meant to be a practice to support us in building resilience so we can respond to what's going on, but still maintain a practice of rest, right? Or is it tied to suffering so much and not being able to thrive and then having to continue to like show up? Is that resilience? I don't know. I mean, I think many of us have been conditioned to believe like resilience is connected to suffering through pain. And I'm not actually sure. Like maybe resilience comes from allowing ourselves to process what we need to process, to rest when we need to rest, to create these conditions we're talking about for everyone to thrive. Like maybe that's resilience because we know more suffering, or I think we do, is coming. There's evidence that like we will continue to suffer in this way as humans on the planet, and we will suffer more if we do not change how we are with one another and how we treat the planet. Like that's pretty clear. And so I feel like, over the years, and I would say over the last maybe 5 to 7 years, I've started to think about rest in a different way. And there certainly is a narrative and it has to do with how I came into the world, where I was like fighting to live, where resilience has been connected to like surviving the harshest conditions, right? And I'm not willing to embrace that anymore as my definition of resilience. And so many people are talking about grief now. So many people are talking about rest, more than I've ever been in community with. I'm sure people have been talking about it forever, but it feels like I see more written about it, shared about it, practices that are being led for us to rest, because rest is an antidote to the toxic culture. And if we do not rest, we actually can't sustain the practices we need to sustain to decrease the suffering on the planet. Or this is what I believe about, how essential this and why the rest practice is essential. And in particular, in the organization I was talking about, where I worked, and wholeness really came to me in a different way. I experienced needing to lean into my wholeness in a different way and call the organization into that. I said no more that year than I've ever said in my life. And I said no to like, no, you told me it was going to be this way. No, I'm not working that extra day. No, I'm not flying across the country to do this training, coming back for a day and then flying somewhere else. No, like I said no almost every day. And to the point where I started to feel like I wasn't myself, because it was like I was saying no all the time. And I realized I was saying no to this system that actually wasn't going to prioritize my care, and certainly not a practice of rest. And a system that did not share my same definition or sort of vision of what resilience is, and how we build resilience, collective resilience. And it was a real teacher to say no that much, and to try to hold those boundaries for myself and others in the organization, because I was supervising a lot of people in that space too. And and I was kind of like, if this organization's not going to prioritize care, how in my role can I do that? And one way I did that is by saying no, which may feel counterintuitive to people. And it's actually, in my experience, a pretty powerful practice, because I'm saying yes, as many people have said, to myself or to new ways of being that I feel like are critical if we're going to move through the time we're living in right now, and if we're going to have a planet for future generations as well.
Yeah, I love that you talked about kind of like slowing down and in relation to nature. And it sounds like healing comes from this, and you mentioned time and remembering it, comes from this space of remembering our true nature, which in the book you say is inseparable from your intuition, right? Like these returning to more simplistic, natural ways of being, saying yes to yourself, moving with the pace of the seasons around you. And the truth is, our ancestors, like they hold the key to that knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. Like one of your teachers in the book you said shared the importance of being free is that you must remember to remember. Mm-hmm. Remembering where we came from, unpacking the history and the depth, and understanding our systemic past and our cultural trauma. So like, how do we begin to heal and walk on that path of those whose shoulders we stand on or who came before us? How do we begin to embody the wisdom of our ancestors in these indigenous traditions?
Yeah, I feel like what you just named is so important, because if we are going to be in a practice of remembering, we have to acknowledge that these practices are not new. They're actually quite old, and honoring that feels important to me. Especially because of capitalism, where things are commodified and like sold as if they're new. These are very old practices, ancient practices, actually, of working with the seasons, of slowing down, of resting, right? Of growing our own food, of connecting with the natural world in the myriad ways we can connect with the natural world, of being less busy, right? And working with the natural rhythms that are present around us all the time, particularly in the natural world. So I just want to name, like, to your point, the ancestors hold the key, which means these aren't new. And it really is a process of remembering, which is so much of what I feel like this moment and the ancestors are calling us into. Because what we've developed and the way we're functioning right now, I feel like there are many signs that it's not sustainable. Things are breaking down, things are falling apart. Maybe that's always true, because that's part of the cycle of death and life and rebirth. Perhaps that's the cycle. And yet I feel like there are so many examples of how things are falling apart. And sometimes people's response to that is to try to control things that we actually are not necessarily in control of, or to respond to uncertainty with more control.
So I think you just touched a little bit on rituals and habits, and I think a part of the spiritual practices, and we know this as yogis, like these habits, these things that just become repetitive action. So can you talk more just a little bit about why rituals and habits are important when we talk about building and sustaining joy? And maybe you just answered it, but just to touch a little bit more on the rituals, because I think that's such an important aspect of, like, there feels like there's just this global shift of people coming back together, and a part of coming back together are these gatherings, these ritualistic practices. So like, how does that build and sustain joy in your eyes?
In my experience, and I think you're right, I've started to meet with people, groups in person again, and I'm noticing both the sort of social awkwardness of that, like how do we relate? And it's particularly, I spent 4 days this past weekend with a mask, teaching with a mask, and everyone else in the space had a mask, and we still couldn't see each other unless we went outside. And this was an agreement the group made with each other. I also, in that space really, and in other spaces I've been in recently, have felt people are starving for connection and community, which is, connection and community are not new. People have been in community and building community. This is how we disrupt these systems that we're talking about that are toxic. This is how we heal. We do it together, right? But there is something about trying to come back into community and I hesitate to say at the end of a global pandemic because I don't know what we're doing, but in the midst of a pandemic and all that comes along with that, like that, the experience of coming together in the face of that, and some of the things you mentioned at the beginning, like social unrest and political unrest and just all of the uncertainty, it feels different. And in these spaces, I feel like rituals like breathing together, which I feel like reminds us of our life force and our vitality and what it means to be in connection. Like my breath is connected with your breath, even as we're talking through a computer screen, right? We're still breathing together in this space. That to me feels tied to liberation and joy, right? When we call ourselves into this space and say, I'm present here and I'm in this community, that means I'm like saying I'm intentionally here, right? And I'm here with whomever might be in this space with me. And I think that connects with joy, the spontaneous laughter that can happen in community as a ritual, the chanting, the prayer, the reflection, the sort of small group connections and large group connections, the movement, right? Moving with people in many different ways, moving, communing and sharing a meal, breaking bread, right? Which is a ritual and a deep ancestral practice as well. Working with the elements, fire, water, and earth, and air, and the above and below. These are rituals as well. Dreaming together, right, is a ritual and practice, which is, what our ancestors did. I think it's why I'm here. They dreamt me up, right? Like this is why we are here having this conversation right now in this way. So I feel like the rituals, and there are many more that I named, are certainly connected to joy and how we find our joy through one another, through our divinity, through remembering our interconnectedness. That feels like a link for me.
Yeah, that was like, it made me tear up. So powerful to think about like my ancestors dreaming me up, like, wow. I want to pause and go back to life cycles, because you just mentioned life cycles and faith. And I want to talk about like this story in your past. You reflect on a story, and it's the day that you held a memorial for your father, and your grandmother, she suffers a stroke, and then 2 days later she transitioned, which you've shared a little bit about. And in the book, you share a glimpse of your grandmother's legacy of living a life of service and connection to her faith when you find these white church gloves in her room after she passes. And there's this understanding of being at peace as we descend upon the journey towards death or the spirit world or whatever's next for you in your practice, and that the spirit or the soul and the physical body is releasing this trauma. And as the two of us in our audience, we're still on this physical plane. We're navigating these very real physical bodies that the recreational vehicles that we're getting around in. Like, how do we integrate that deep understanding of everything that we've talked about into a real, everyday embodied practice of healing? Because in the book, you say it so perfectly that you say, although occasionally I don't know I am grieving until I'm sick in bed, or until I slow down enough to feel what is present before me, I am thankful for the ability to grieve. I am thankful for the container that this spiritual practice creates for my grief. Your individual and or collective grief deserves to be seen. You said it earlier, like in work, like they weren't seeing your grief, but it deserves to be seen. It deserves to be held, felt, cared for. And the spiritual practice can hold it all. And you open up about your grandmother kind of being the gateway to this truth. And when I was traveling around and being introduced to all these roots of spirituality, I started to think about the fact that my grandmothers were really the only ones in my youth that had instilled that spiritual, contemplative or faith-based practice in my life. So maybe you can just share a little bit about the importance of spirituality and the broadness of what spirituality means to you, why it's so important to have faith.
Yeah, I will speak about my grandmother, and your question and faith is making me think about, I have honeybees, and there's a chapter about them. And there's a swarm, a hive swarmed last week. It's a long story, but they've been in the tree for 7 days now. They moved up then they moved back down. I'm not exactly sure what is going on, and they're too high for me to catch them, meaning to put them in a hive box or relocate them to a tree. They're like on a tree branch. And they're making me think about faith because they're doing something that I don't understand, that I can't see because they're clumped together, and I assume the queen is in the middle. I go out and watch them every day, multiple times a day. They're communicating, bees are coming and going. And I was really struck by, it came to me last weekend, by the reality that I think they have faith they can build there. And what does it mean to like have that level of faith when they're like out in the open? When it's probably going to storm this weekend, and maybe they'll leave and maybe they'll stay. They move down to a more protected place in the tree, right? There is a higher intelligence, and faith feels connected to that as well, and spirituality, right? This higher source and higher intelligence, and understanding that there's mystery and there are things that are happening and unfolding that we cannot see or touch, and that we may not understand now or later. And that it's all connected, what has been, what is now, and what will be, which is a lot for a human body to hold and sort of be with. And we must remember we're spiritual beings as well. And my grandmother and my mother and the elders in church taught me that. Like every Sunday we went to church, and I witnessed folks in community, and this was a Black Baptist church. So myself and a group of people who have historically been oppressed and continue to experience oppression go and pray with the belief that there was something better, something more. And I don't mean more is better. I mean like something more expansive than the human condition, because that was what they were showing up and like praying for, that there was something bigger. And my grandmother trusted that, you know, God had a plan and has a plan. Like she trusted that, and she said it, and she read her Bible every day, and she was a church usher as well, which I have her gloves on my ancestor altar behind me. And when I saw them, they just made me, they sort of encapsulate her spirit of service and community and faith, to your point and your question. And I just know for myself, without that shaping of a community that is practicing holding faith, right? And coming together and feeding one another, right? And all the ways I named earlier about collective care. If I had not experienced that, I'm not sure I'm not sure the depth that is present for me around spiritual practice would be present. I'm just not sure. Because their faith taught me about devotion. And when I think about my yoga practice and service, it feels like it is one of devotion. It's like rooted in that. What am I devoted to? And if I'm devoted to the highest good, not just for myself, but for all beings, not that I know exactly what that is or could describe it to you, but if I'm devoted to something that is bigger than me, that calls me into something bigger, calls me into a deeper practice. It calls me to be of service. It calls me to be responsible. It calls me to be accountable. And that all of that, and it calls me to hold faith, just like that honeybee swarm. Somehow there's some faith, right? We can build here, we can be here. You can't see it, you don't know what's going on, but it's possible. So this kind of devotion also calls me into possibility, the possibility that we can dream up something that has not been, or we can remember something that has been and dream ourselves into that now. And that feels like the essential work that we actually need to do. So, you know, deep bow to my grandmother and my mother and the elders and the honeybees and all of the beings that remind me to have faith amid so much suffering. And practice has been the container, as you read, that has held me through the deepest suffering. And without a practice rooted in faith, I'm not sure I would be here. I'm just not sure. You know, the practice calling me to breathe when I feel like I can't breathe because of the trauma of what's going on in the world. The practice calling me into seeing my divinity and the divinity held within others, right? These are, ancient, deep practices, and they provide the foundation and sort of also buoyancy to respond to the suffering and to feel and lean into joy as well.
I love that. I love the idea of just, simply like having that contemplative moment of watching the honeybees and like having this completely expansive thought or story just by simply observing something in nature. I think it's so powerful, and I think people take that power for granted, that simplicity of just observing something in nature. And so Michelle, I would love to like move into a hive with you right now and into a practice space. And I'm just hoping and inviting you to maybe lead our audience, in a best practice that, you've have that we can apply to overcome grief and maybe help us move our vibration towards joy. And so if you'd be open to it, just to lead a guided practice today that our audience can incorporate into their lives, we'd be so grateful.
Absolutely. I think I'm going to call on the honeybees actually for this practice, which feels like I'm calling on the ancestors too. So I'll invite folks to, take a moment to find a way to be in your body, and you can be seated for this, or if you want to move for this, you can. I'm going to invite us to breathe, and then I'll invite us on a journey with the hive, since we are a collective, and this will work with the themes of grief and joy, as well as darkness and light and celebration. So find a way to be. Your eyes can be open, closed, or a soft gaze on the ground in front, and your hands can rest wherever feels most comfortable. And I invite you to take a moment to adjust your posture, your body, so you can really settle into this practice. And now I invite you to bring your awareness and attention to your breath, and to begin to feel your inhales and exhales. And as you inhale and exhale, you can feel the body move, the expansiveness as you breathe in, the ribs contract, and the breath empty from your body as you exhale. And breathing here, beginning to deepen the breath, really makes me think about the inhale and exhale, as one of my bee teachers talks about, of the hive, the entrance and exit, the way the bees and we enter and the way we exit. The way the inhale can feel like birthing, and then we release and let go with the exhale, experiencing the death of the breath before we invite in another in-breath. The breath is such a good teacher that mirrors so many things that seem like they're polarities or many dualities. Breathing in, breathing out, grief, joy, dark and light. Sorrow and celebration. These things are actually interconnected and in deep relationship, and not necessarily polar opposites. One would not exist without the other. You can feel this in your body with your exhales, that the exhale would not exist without the inhale. And the next inhale would not exist without the previous exhale. And as you breathe here, feel the expansiveness, the contraction, your in-breaths, your out-breaths. I'll invite you to imagine you are entering a hive. Now, if you are afraid of honeybees, you can imagine something else. And I experience honeybees as benevolent beings. And you could also call on other benevolent beings to be in relationship with if there's some fear around imagining entering a hive. We'll also say we're all part of a hive because we are interconnected. So you decide. If the honeybee hive feels resonant for you, I'll invite you to imagine entering a honeybee hive. And honeybee hives are dark inside. There's very little light. And so they work in the dark. They bump against one another. They vibrate. They dance. They birth. Sometimes they die in the hive. They create sweet honey. They store nectar and pollen. They tend their babies, the brood. They care for the queen, the matriarch. All of this happens in the dark. And this, to me, reminds me of our capacity to work in the dark when we do not necessarily see all of the steps forward or a pathway forward, to trust there is one. This also reminds me of the light. The light exists outside of the hive. There is sunlight, there is daylight, a little crack of light coming into the hive as well. And the bees go about their work. And so you're in the hive just observing them do all of the things they do in the darkness. This also reminds me of grief and how it can feel heavy or at times dark, uncertain, and how grief really asks us to move with it, to be with it, to allow it to process through. And to remember joy, remember the things that can exist alongside grief. And as you are in this hive and watching the bees do their work, know, as I named, there are bees that are tending to the brood. The queen might be laying eggs. There are bees coming in from the outside, passing along nectar to their sisters. There are bees fanning, taking the water out of the nectar to create honey. There are undertakers taking out the dead bees that may have died in the hive. There are bees building honeycomb. There are bees resting. In a hive, there are always some bees who rest so they can be ready for their work when it's time. And I invite you to sort of witness and observe how this hive works in concert with one another as a superorganism to sustain itself. Everything is for the good of the hive. This feels like a joyous experience and thought, for all of it to be about the collective. At a certain stage in a bee's life cycle, they become foragers, and they gather nectar and pollen from flowers. They gather water for the hive. They gather tree resin to create propolis to seal the hive. They go out and gather and then bring it back to the hive. And when a bee has found a very good source of water or pollen or nectar, they do a dance called the waggle dance to tell their sisters where this good source of water, pollen, or nectar might be. It is the most amazing sight to see them dance. And so now I invite you to imagine you are a forager, and to imagine transitioning out of the darkness and into the light to go gather resources for the hive. You might find a beautiful rose bush. My bees were pollinating the roses today. You might find a bird bath in someone's yard to gather water, to take back to the hive, to cool it. Might find a butterfly bush, a bloom on a tomato plant, bee balm, mint, sunflowers. Gather a resource for the hive as you are out in the light. And take a moment to feel what it is like to gather something for the sustenance of the hive. The joy that comes from gathering, not for yourself, but for us. Feel the freedom in this act of gathering and carrying a resource back to the hive. Take a few more deep breaths here, gathering and returning to the hive. Listening to the vibration of the hive. And as we come out of this practice, I invite you to really consider your own journey, your process, your relationship with grief and joy and liberation and the collective hive, and to consider what it is you want to gather and bring back to the hive. When you feel ready, you can blink open your eyes, gently returning to your space after that journey. And welcome back.
That was such a beautiful journey that you just took us on. And as a gardener, I can say that there is something really powerful about like going out and harvesting and gathering your food and feeling this gift that you're not only receiving but being able to give back. And it, as we were going through the journey, it made me think of this quote that Vandana Shiva, a climate activist, shared in a recent program that we did with her. And she said, like the most joyful, beautiful thing that you can give to yourself and offer to the world is to start a garden and to have that experience of working with plants. And it, as you were telling the story of the honeybees and their process, which like, I don't have bees, so it was like magical to like hear all these little nuances of their journey, but it made me think of like bees as agents for change and like adding to the hive. And it kind of leads into the end of the journey of your book, which is the taproot, right? Like you and I have talked about this before, about how we're like connected as humans through these vast energetic and ancestral root systems, just as like these deep taproots are like laterally spreading out and connecting everything in nature. And you describe in the book these taproots as the ability to understand that we're catalysts for change, for good in the world, and collective healing. And one of the ways that you advocate for collective healing is to become more connected to sentient beings in the natural worlds around you. So can you just take a few moments and maybe share with our, like, first of all, I want to know what's growing in your garden, because I just want to know right now, and why you've been so inspired to cultivate healing through indigenous wisdoms and of plants and animals. And is this an important viewpoint for future generations to follow?
Yeah, I love this question because, I mean, for many reasons, because I haven't always identified as a gardener. This might be the first summer, even though people have identified me as a gardener. But I was kind of like, I do have a big garden out there, and I am growing my food, and I have chickens, and I have bees, and there are flowers everywhere. Like I am cultivating a relationship with the land. And this year, the garden is more abundant than it has ever been. And I've had more time to tend the garden too, which really makes me think about making space, rest, slowing down, to watch the earthworms, to prune the flowers, to harvest, right? To attend to something, a plant that may need attention, to go talk to the chickens and feed them nasturtium, which I just fed them yesterday. So there's so much about the land and the beings that live here with me, and deep gratitude, and so much joy that comes from like watching the hummingbirds, which I did this morning for I don't know how long, come to the feeder, or they go to the bee balm. So I have in my garden, I have a vegetable garden, and I have a bunch of tomatoes and cucumbers. And even the process of like, I'm going to pickle these cucumbers, which I've done before, but I need them to last longer. So I'm like researching that. Like when you harvest, it's not something, you know this, I'm not telling you anything. Like you can't just pick the thing. If you want to keep it, then you have to process it and do something with it. Or sometimes even if you want to give it away to someone, you need to do that. Or if you're thinking about like through winter, we need these foods, which my grandparents did. They had a bookshelf, a wall of canned vegetables and fruits, and that's what got them through the winter. So I have a vegetable garden with many vegetables, zucchinis, more than I've ever grown before, potatoes, so many tomatoes. And in my garden out in the yard, I have dahlias that are really beautiful right now, a rose bush that feels connected to my grandfather, Fred. There's a huge oak tree in the back that is Dorothy, my grandmother, and she sort of watches over it all. I have 2 fig trees the figs are ripening now, and they're just delicious to pick off the tree and eat. And I have bee balm, which bloomed earlier, but I pruned it, and it's blooming again, which is really exciting because I love looking at it, but also because the bees, it's a dearth time this time of year in North Carolina in August. So the bees will have more nectar to gather from the bee balm as it moves into a second and sometimes third blooming if you prune it. And I had sunflowers, which the finches, the yellow finches love. And I have a tailless squirrel. We've named him Bob. And he's been eating the sunflower seeds as well. There's a whole thing happening in my yard.
I love it. What a vast
entire thing.
ecosystem. I love that. I love like even that act of pruning, right? Like it's that spiritual practice, like attending and pruning, and then like inevitably it'll bloom again and come back, and just that awareness to be in relationship with it. I love it, Michelle. I think it's incredible. What's coming up for you next? What do you have in the pipeline? And what are any last closing thoughts that you want to share with our audience today?
Well, one that I'll say that, I just described like a garden with an awareness that I've had time to tend the garden. And I want to say, like, before I had a yard where I could plant these things, I had plants in my house. There are some around me now. And I had a relationship with them. And so I just want to tell people, like, you don't have to do what I might be doing or others are doing. There's a way we can connect with there are many ways we can connect with the natural world and other living beings and tend them. And I would invite people to do that. You know, it can be small and profound, or seem simple and be very profound and deep. It does not have to be like having 2 hours a day to go water the garden. Like, that doesn't have to look like that. So I just want to name that for people. It can happen in so many ways, and we have to find our path. And I think it's essential that we find our pathway or remember our connection with the natural world, because it is part of the spiritual practice and what will help heal us for sure. So I have a lot of things coming up, but one thing I'll mention, which really speaks to what we talked about today, is it will not come out until April, although pre-orders will begin, I think, in December. I have another book coming out. It's titled We Heal Together, Practices to Bring Us in Community and Divine Connection. And it is similar it's a sibling defining refuge. And the structure is similar in that there are personal stories, although they're not about grief. Grief and joy are centered, and liberation are centered in it. But it's not necessarily as focused on cultural or collective grief. That's a theme and thread, but that's more present in finding refuge. And it really is about, how do we come back into connection? I mean, it's everything we talked about. And each chapter ends with, similar to finding refuge, a practice or ritual. And the rituals, if someone is trying to find community, there are rituals for that. But there are also rituals meant to be done in community. Like there's a yoga nidra practice meant to be done in a group to dream about the world in which we want to live, right? There are practices that are meant to be done in community that engage the elements in the way that we've been talking about. There are journaling prompts throughout as well. So I'm excited about it for many reasons. And one of the main reasons is because it's like calling people into community and into the remembering that we spoke about. So we heal together. That's the thing I'll name that's coming up. And I'm so grateful that the words came through and the ancestors spoke through me, and can't wait for it to be in physical form.
Well, I know I can't, and we can't wait either, Michelle. Like, thank you so much. You're truly, like, what a honor for me. You're one of my teachers. I'll say that, forever. Your practical wisdom is so powerful for me and so many in our community, and I'm grateful for you and for always helping to guide us through this deep generative process of holding grief, and just truly inspiring us all to interrupt systems and patterns that cause this suffering. I mean, I know it takes an immense amount of physical, emotional, spiritual energy to hold space for people every day the way that you do. So just a deep bow of gratitude for how gracefully and honestly you show up for yourself and for others.
Thank you so much. And thanks for this conversation and for the work you do. And for being one of my teachers as well, and for your practice and modeling. Thank you.
Thank you. So in the Book of Joy with His Holiness, the Dalai Lama and Archbishop Desmond Tutu, they talk about the fact that we don't need to be superheroes from the start. It's okay to pause, to rest, to grieve, to cry, as I have teared up many times through this conversation. We can pull from all of these vast life experiences and build a foundation for joy to truly thrive. And I think Archbishop Tutu said it perfectly when he said, "You are made for perfection, but you are not yet perfect. You are a masterpiece in the making. So, Michelle, thank you for inviting us in to water the seed and watch it grow into a masterpiece.
Thank you so much.
See